Normite, Haidamite, welcome. I'm Bruce Munro, and with me is International Relations Specialist, Professor Robert Patman. This is Global Insight. US Vice President J.D. Vance's bombshell speech at last year's Munich Security Conference signalled the White House was about to tip the world order upside down. On the eve of this year's key global security gathering, we look at how the world has changed in the past 12 months and ask what changes might be just around the corner. Welcome, Robert.
Morena, Bruce. Thank you.
Why is the annual Munich Security Conference so important?
Well, it was established in 1963 and it's the leading forum in the world for the discussion of international security. And as your lead remarks indicated, American officials, this year I think it's Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, will be speaking. It's an area, at least 50 leaders this year have been invited. It's also attended by some leading academics and specialists around the world. For people interested in security, it's a must really. But it's also an area where sometimes new diplomatic initiatives have been launched, particularly in the security sphere.
We mentioned J.D. Vance's speech last year. What has changed in the world since the last conference?
Quite a lot. And if I was to summarise it, I think there has been a loss of illusions about Mr. Trump's policies. It was quite clear that Trump had led Mr. Vance's speech and Trump's policies in the early part of the administration caused a real rift in transatlantic relations. How did most liberal democracies, including our own actually, respond to that by a sort of softly approach in the hope that the sort of firebrand impact of the administration could be gradually extinguished and the administration would become domesticated and pursue much more moderate policies through coaxing, encouragement and large amounts of flattery for to stroke Mr. Trump's ego. Well, what we do know a year later is that hasn't worked, and the crucial development in that evolution was the National Security Strategy document released in December 25, which I think effectively confirmed that the Trump administration does not share the values and the interests of most of its liberal democratic allies. In particular, it has no time for what's called an international rules-based order.
This coming Saturday, Marco Rubio will be speaking to the world leaders and top diplomats gathered in Munich. Will he be trying to repair the damage of the past year?
In part, Rubio is perhaps one of the more serious members of the administration. When I say serious, I mean he's got an intellectual grasp of foreign policy, although he's quite on the far right of the political spectrum. And many people question Rubio's judgment in working with Trump because Rubio was a rival of Trump in the past for the top job in the Republican Party. So I think he's going to have a balancing act. Europe still remains enormously important to the United States. The United States has been urging Europe to become much more self-sufficient in terms of its military capabilities. And in a sense, you can understand that request. As a German diplomat remarked, it's not unreasonable to expect 460 million Europeans to take more responsibility for their defence, particularly with the perceived Russian threat, rather than relying on 330 million Americans. So I can understand that. And what has happened is that Trump probably has energised NATO to some degree. They are spending a lot more on defence now. But there is, quite apart from that issue, there is also, I think what Rubio would try to convey is that this is a different relationship, but it's still very important to the United States. I'm not sure that will be enough for Europeans. The Europeans, for Trump's speech at Davos earlier this month, really went down badly. And Mr. Trump did actually back off. He won't admit that because he conceded he could not use force, or he would not use force in Greenland, but he hasn't given up his ambitions to own Greenland. He's also made this preposterous, repeated claim that Canada should be the 51st state of Canada should be the 51st state of the United States. So I think these issues are not going away. There's a real sense, I think, that there's a realization that American policy will not change. Rubio may be the most acceptable face of American policy, but he's not going to win the Europeans over, because Rubio was very supportive of the intervention in Venezuela and, of course, the blockade that's been ongoing against Cuba, which is having quite dire effects. So I think, yes, he will try. It will be a bit of a repair job, but I don't think you can expect Rubio to backtrack on the fundamentals of a foreign policy which many Europeans find offensive.
So if we see the previous world order crumbling, and if that's in fact what is happening, what are some of the key impacts of that you see?
Well, there's a number of manifestations of a rules-based order under strain. I don't think it's over. We shouldn't lose sight of the fact that much of the world is interconnected through technology, and the world is connected through travel, and so all these interconnections need rules. So we've had an expansion of rules, and for most countries, like middle powers and small powers, rules are absolutely essential. They can't throw their weight around on a daily basis. So rules are important. So we shouldn't exaggerate it, but there's no doubt about it that the vision of international relations being based on rules is basically under strain. And of course the United States has been the wrecking ball in chief for the last year. But it's, of course, China is selective about the rules it follows, and Russia, of course, with its invasion of Ukraine, is definitely challenging a rules-based order. So might is right is a philosophy which the great powers seem to ultimately adhere to. And with respect to your question, given that context, I think there's a number of manifestations of the crumbling rules-based order, if that's the right way of putting it. First of all, we had this disgraceful conflict in Gaza, prolonged for more than 2 years. And the consequences led to a so-called board of peace, in which people like Netanyahu and Trump, who played a key role in the suffering of so many people in Gaza, are also presiding over the so-called peace. In fact, the peace hasn't been kept. More than 400 Palestinians have been killed since the ceasefire was introduced. So another thing is the paralysis of the UN Security Council. With renewed geopolitical rivals between the great powers, that has made the UN Security Council even less functional. And I think the most depressing thing, Bruce, has been the loss of global leadership. You see, many great powers assume by attacking a rules-based order they can extend their sovereignty. This is the whole assumption behind America First and Mr. Trump's approach. But they can't. Why? Because the problems are too big for great powers to solve. So when great powers turn their back on a rules-based order and go for unilateral measures, all they're doing is showing weakness in face of problems they can't handle. Problems like climate change, pandemics. The US recently withdrew and reduced its support for the WHO, the World Health Authority. This may win some applause at home, but it means that these problems, such as transnational terrorism, these problems are not going to go away. They're just too big for countries to fix. At the same time, they're undermining the machinery for collective responses to those problems, which do not recognise borders. So, in a sense, we're living through, I think, we're sleepwalking into major problems in the next 10 years, simply because we have this fantasy that great powers can run the world when they clearly can't.
That's all quite grim. Are there any bright spots around the globe or even on the horizon?
Yes, I think there are. And I think I say that because I have the great privilege of teaching young people at university. And admittedly, those young people are not a cross-section of society. But I do think if people don't have a vision of a better future, then that aspiration is unlikely to be achieved. If you write off the world, then the world's not going to fix itself. And I'm enthused, as I am every year, by how many young people feel passionately that we're not doing well enough as a country and we're not doing well enough as a global community in tackling problems. It's, you know, as Willy Brandt once said, problems created by human beings can be fixed by them. There's no need for defeatism. And the bright spots, I think, are as follows. Firstly, Mr. Trump's America First foreign policy is not popular in the United States. He's facing real domestic problems selling his message. He's got in particular problems with his attempt to resolve the Ukraine war on Putin's terms. Most Americans, 80% of them according to polls, reject Mr. Trump's affection for Mr. Putin. They see him as the aggressor, and quite rightly so, because he invaded a sovereign country. So I think, you know, that may have, particularly with the midterms coming up, if they're held, that could have serious political restraints on Trump's foreign policy. I think another bright spot is that, and it flows from what we said earlier, that many liberal democracies are beginning to wake up to the fact they actually are not, in Carney's words, Mark Carney's words, they're not powerless. They don't have to rely on great powers to fix the world's problems. They do have the ability to organise, and that's Carney's speech at Davos for me was a major bright spot, because he provided a template for many liberal democracies who've been floundering. They've been trying to have a softly approach to a Trump administration which has not responded. In fact, the softly approach has encouraged Trump to escalate demands. And that often happens with a bully, a narcissistic bully, that if you try to appease them, they only escalate their demands. So I think there is a bright spot there, and I think in the next year is going to be very interesting, because I think a number of middle powers, the signs are Australia, Canada, a number of European countries, Norway in particular has been outspoken about US foreign policy, are beginning to realise they can't rely on the United States in the way, and that may be a good thing. It may ultimately force small and middle countries, middle powers, to take more responsibility for the problems we all face. And remember, we are talking about the majority of countries in the world. More than 180 are either small countries or middle powers. So in a sense, that is a bright spot, but it certainly doesn't in any way reduce some of the miseries that many people are experiencing around the planet at the moment. And it's a long-term bright spot rather than a short-term one.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Ka kite anō.